Picture the Grand Canyon just before sunrise. The air is still cold from the desert night, and the first light hasn't yet touched the bottom of the gorge. Down there, in shadows that have existed for millions of years, the rock walls hold colours no camera can quite capture. Deep reds, burnt oranges, layers of stone stacked like pages in the oldest book on earth. Each layer represents thousands, sometimes millions of years of history. Rivers that dried up, seas that vanished, creatures that lived and died long before anything resembling a human ever took a breath. It's the kind of place that makes you feel impossibly small and impossibly curious. Because when you stare into a canyon a mile deep and think about everything it has quietly witnessed, you start to wonder, what else might be hiding in there? What other secrets are folded into those ancient walls, waiting for someone to stumble across them? In April of 1909, a newspaper in Phoenix, Arizona, published a story that suggested exactly that. It described a hidden cave deep within the canyon, a place that could only be reached by a long and dangerous journey through the Colorado River. Inside, according to the article, explorers had found tunnels carved into solid rock, chambers filled with strange artifacts, tools made of copper, weapons unlike anything seen in the region, and idols that seemed to belong to a civilization nobody could quite explain. There were even claims of mummified remains, and symbols that some believed resembled ancient hieroglyphs, as if a thread connected this remote corner of the American Southwest to the ancient world of Egypt. It sounds almost too strange to be real, and maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. That's the beautiful, frustrating thing about this story. Over a century later, we still don't have a clear answer. No cave matching that description has ever been found again. The Smithsonian, the institution supposedly connected to the discovery, has denied any knowledge of it. And yet the story refuses to disappear. It keeps getting passed along, whispered about, searched for, because something about it still feels unfinished. Tonight, we're going to slowly walk through this mystery together, not rushing toward conclusions, not trying to prove anything one way or the other, just gently exploring the layers of this story, the same way the Colorado River carved through layers of stone. We'll look at who supposedly made the discovery, what exactly was reported, why the Smithsonian said what it said, and why, even without solid evidence, so many people still find themselves drawn to the idea that there might be more hidden beneath the canyon floor than we currently understand. If you're listening to this as you're drifting off to sleep, that's exactly why I make these. So if you'd like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right where you are. I love seeing those little snapshots roll in. Someone in Sydney just waking up. Someone in Lisbon finally closing their eyes. It's a strange, quiet comfort knowing this story is travelling around the world, while most of you are trying to fall asleep. And if you'd like a version of this without any music or ads playing in the background, something even more seamless for sleep, I've started uploading those to Spotify. Following me there also helps support the channel in a way that costs you nothing. So if that sounds useful to you, go ahead and follow along. Now, let's go back to where this story truly begins. Not deep in the canyon just yet, but at the surface, in a moment in American history when exploration itself felt like magic. When newspapers competed for the wildest headlines, and the American West still held enough mystery that almost anything seemed possible. It's 1909, and the world is about to be told about a discovery unlike anything else. 1909 was a strange and wonderful time to be alive in the American West. The frontier, as people had once understood it, was closing. The wild, lawless expanses that had defined the region for generations were being mapped, fenced, and settled at a pace that would have seemed impossible just a few decades earlier. Railroads stretched across the desert like iron veins. Towns were sprouting up in places that had been empty wilderness only a generation before. And yet, despite all of this progress, or maybe because of it, there remained a hunger in the American imagination for mystery, for the unknown, for places that hadn't yet been fully tamed. The Grand Canyon was one of those places. It's easy to forget, looking at it today with its paved overlooks and gift shops, that in 1909 the Grand Canyon was still something new to most Americans. It had only been declared a national monument 3 years earlier in 1906, and wouldn't become a national park for another decade. Before that, it existed mostly as rumour and legend, a geological curiosity known intimately by the native peoples who had lived alongside it for thousands of years, but only recently discovered by the wider American public. Photographs of the canyon had begun circulating in magazines and postcards, and for many people back east, seeing those images for the first time felt like glimpsing another planet. A mile-deep gorge carved into the earth, stretching for hundreds of miles, layered with rock in colours that seemed too vivid to be real. Tourists were beginning to arrive, but only in a trickle. The journey itself was an adventure. There were no smooth highways, no easy trails. Getting to the rim required days of travel by train and then stagecoach, bouncing along dusty roads through unforgiving desert. And once you arrived, the canyon itself remained largely a mystery. Most visitors stood at the edge, peered into that impossible depth, and went no further. The rim was one thing. The canyon floor, the winding river far below, the countless side canyons branching off into shadow. Those were still the domain of only the boldest explorers. This was the age of men like John Wesley Powell, whose famous river expeditions decades earlier had captured the public imagination by proving that the Colorado River could be navigated at all, even if it nearly killed the men who tried. By 1909, Powell's journeys had become legendary, retold and embellished in newspapers and dime novels, inspiring a new generation of adventurers who dreamed of following in his footsteps. The Colorado River itself was still considered one of the most dangerous stretches of water in North America. Its rapids were unpredictable, its currents deceptively powerful, and its canyon walls so steep and confusing that a person could become hopelessly lost within sight of civilization. And that's really the key thing to understand about this era. Even as the modern world was rushing forward, telephones, automobiles, electric lights, entire sections of the Grand Canyon remained essentially unexplored. Not unexplored in the sense that no human being had ever set foot there. Native peoples had known these canyons intimately for countless generations, understood their secret paths and hidden water sources far better than any outsider ever would. But unexplored in the sense that no map existed showing every side canyon, every cave, every hidden alcove tucked into those endless layers of stone. There were still blank spaces on the charts, places where a person venturing off the known paths might genuinely discover something nobody else had ever documented. This was the spirit of the age, a strange overlap between old world mystery and new world ambition. Newspapers loved nothing more than a story of daring exploration, especially one that suggested the American landscape still held secrets equal to anything found in Egypt or South America. Readers back east, sipping their coffee in cities that already had electric streetcars, wanted desperately to believe that somewhere out west, in that vast red desert, there were still mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Lost cities, ancient tombs, evidence of some forgotten civilization that might rewrite everything people thought they knew about the past. It's important to hold on to that feeling as we move forward into this story, because whatever the truth turns out to be about what happened next, the world in 1909 was primed and ready for exactly this kind of tale. A remote, dangerous river, a hidden cave nobody had ever seen, and a discovery so strange that it would ripple through newspapers within days, capturing the imagination of a public that desperately wanted to believe the age of exploration wasn't over just yet. And then, on April 5, 1909, The world that had been primed and ready for exactly this kind of tale got exactly what it was asking for. On that particular morning, readers of the Phoenix Gazette in Arizona opened their papers to find a headline that must have made their coffee cups tremble in their hands. Bold type spanning the width of the page declaring that explorers had found relics in the Grand Canyon, indicating an ancient civilization of remarkable sophistication had once inhabited those remote, seemingly impenetrable depths. The article wasn't tucked away in some back corner alongside the local weather report or society gossip. It was front-page news, the kind of sensational stop everything and read this announcement that newspaper editors reserved for wars, presidential assassinations, and the occasional circus elephant running loose through downtown. But this wasn't about any of those things. This was about something far more strange. Something that suggested the American landscape, that vast red desert so many people still thought of as empty and wild, might actually contain secrets comparable to the great archaeological discoveries of Egypt or Mesopotamia. The core claims laid out in that article were staggering. According to the Gazette, a man named G. E. Kincaid, described as an explorer employed by the federal government, had been travelling alone down the Colorado River in a small wooden boat when he discovered an enormous cave system hidden deep within the canyon walls. Not a small alcove or a shallow shelter, a vast underground complex extending hundreds of feet into the rock, containing passages and chambers that had been carefully carved and finished by human hands long before any European had ever set foot on the continent. Inside these chambers, Kincaid claimed to have found relics of a lost civilization, copper tools and weapons, mysterious artifacts of unknown purpose. And most astonishing of all, hundreds of mummies carefully stored in rock-cut niches, preserved for centuries in the dry desert air. There was even mention of a strange idol resembling nothing familiar from any known Native American culture, seated in what appeared to be a central shrine or ceremonial space. And throughout the cave, covering the walls and ceilings, Kincaid reported finding hieroglyphic markings, not the petroglyphs and pictographs that native peoples had left scattered across the southwest for millennia, but something different, something that, at least according to the article, bore a striking resemblance to Egyptian writing. The tone of the article itself was curious, hovering somewhere between straightforward news reporting and breathless adventure tale. It presented Kincaid's discovery as fact, relating details about the cave's location, its dimensions, and its contents with a kind of specificity that suggested careful documentation. Measurements were given. Descriptions were precise. The whole thing read as though the writer had sat down with Kincaid himself, taken careful notes, and simply transcribed what he had been told. And yet there was also an unmistakable flavour of sensationalism woven through every paragraph. A sense that the writer knew, perhaps instinctively, that this story was too extraordinary, too potentially explosive, to present with the restrained professionalism of a standard news report. This blend of apparent fact and undeniable embellishment was actually quite common in newspapers of that era. The early 1900s were a transitional period in American journalism, a time when the old traditions of sensationalistic penny press reporting still overlapped with the emerging standards of more respectable objective journalism. Newspapers competed fiercely for readers, and in that competitive environment, a story like this one was gold, a lost civilization hidden in the Grand Canyon, ancient Egyptian connections in the American desert, mummies and copper tools and mysterious hieroglyphs. It was exactly the kind of narrative that could sell papers by the thousands. Editors understood this. They routinely stretched facts, amplified dramatic details, and sometimes published stories that were almost entirely fabricated if they thought the public would find them irresistible. This wasn't considered outright fraud in the way we might understand it today. It was more like an accepted form of entertainment. Readers knew, or at least suspected, that newspapers sometimes exaggerated, They consumed these stories with a kind of willing suspension of disbelief, enjoying the thrill of the tale, while understanding that the truth might be somewhat less spectacular than the headlines suggested. The line between news and storytelling was blurry, and publications like the Phoenix Gazette routinely walked right along that edge, sometimes stepping well over it. But even accounting for the era's journalistic habits, even understanding that newspapers routinely embellished and exaggerated, this particular story had qualities that made it spread with unusual speed and persistence. Part of that was sheer specificity. The article didn't just make vague claims about ancient ruins somewhere in the West. It gave detailed measurements. It named a specific explorer. It cited government employment and institutional backing. It provided just enough concrete detail to make the whole thing feel plausible, even inevitable. Like something that could actually happen in a place as vast and poorly documented as the Grand Canyon still was in 1909. And part of it was the implication, if Kincaid's claims were true, if there really was an Egyptian-style cave complex hidden somewhere in the canyon, then the entire understanding of human history in the Americas would need to be rewritten. The standard narrative that the continent had been populated solely by peoples migrating from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge would suddenly seem incomplete. The possibility that some ancient Mediterranean civilization had reached North America thousands of years before Columbus, before the Vikings, before anyone would demand serious consideration. It wasn't just an archaeological curiosity, it was a paradigm-shifting revelation. The kind of discovery that could overturn an entire field of study. That combination, the detailed specificity that made it feel credible, and the enormous implications that made it feel important, gave this story a staying power that most newspaper sensations never achieved. Most dramatic headlines faded within days, replaced by the next crisis, the next scandal, the next adventure. But this one lingered. It passed from newspaper columns into conversation, from conversation into local legend, from legend into a persistent cultural myth that has survived for over a century. Even today, long after the Phoenix Gazette has ceased publication, and the original article has become a yellowed artifact tucked away in archival collections, people still talk about it, still search for that hidden cave, still wonder whether G.E. Kincaid actually found something extraordinary in those remote canyon walls, or whether the whole thing was simply a clever invention designed to sell newspapers on a slow spring morning. And that question, the question of what Kincaid actually found or didn't find, requires us to look more closely at the man himself. Because the story doesn't work without him. He's the foundation upon which everything else rests. The witness, the discoverer, the single human being whose testimony either validates or collapses the entire extraordinary claim. So who was he? Where did he come from? And why, if his discovery was real, has the world heard almost nothing about him beyond that single newspaper article from April 1909? That question, the question of who G.E. Kincaid actually was, leads into one of the strangest and most frustrating corners of this entire mystery. Because the truth is, when you start digging into Kincaid's background, you find almost nothing. Not a little. Not fragments that require careful interpretation. Almost literally nothing. The Phoenix Gazette article describes him with impressive specificity. It calls him a lone explorer, an adventurer travelling alone down the Colorado River in a small wooden boat. It states that he was employed by the federal government, working under the auspices of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. It even gives the impression of a man with extensive experience, someone who had spent years navigating the remote waterways of the American Southwest, someone whose knowledge of the canyon's geography was deep enough to recognize that what he had found was unusual, even unprecedented. The article presents him as a credible figure, a professional doing professional work. Not some wandering prospector or amateur treasure hunter stumbling blindly through the desert, But when researchers have attempted to verify any of these details, to find independent confirmation that such a person actually existed, the results have been consistently and thoroughly empty. No birth records have been located that match his name, no census entries, no employment records with the federal government, no documentation of any kind connecting a person named G.E. Kincaid to the Smithsonian Institution. No other newspaper articles from any publication in any city referencing his expeditions or discoveries. No letters, no diaries, no photographs, nothing. This absence is striking, especially when you consider the era in which Kincaid supposedly operated. The early 1900s were a period of extensive government-sponsored exploration in the American West. Federal agencies, particularly the Smithsonian, were actively funding expeditions to document the geology, biology, and archaeology of regions that were still poorly understood. These expeditions generated enormous amounts of paperwork. Employment records, field reports, budget allocations, correspondence between field workers and institutional administrators. The Smithsonian, in particular, was meticulous about documenting its activities. Every artifact collected, every site surveyed, every employee hired, all of it was recorded and archived. Researchers have spent considerable time searching through those archives, looking for any reference to G.E. Kincaid. They have found nothing. Not a single document, not a single mention, not a single trace that the Smithsonian ever employed anyone by that name for any purpose whatsoever. The same absence extends to the broader world of Western exploration during that period. The community of serious explorers, geologists and archaeologists working in the American Southwest was relatively small and surprisingly well connected. These people knew each other. They published papers, attended conferences, exchanged letters, and shared findings. They left extensive paper trails that historians have been tracing for decades. Within that community, there is no record of anyone named G.E. Kincaid participating in any expedition, making any discovery, or contributing any knowledge to the field. He doesn't appear in the membership rolls of any professional organization. He isn't cited in any scholarly publication. He isn't mentioned in any contemporary diary or correspondence as a colleague, a competitor, or even an acquaintance. So what does this mean? There are essentially three possibilities, and each one leads down a different path of speculation. The first possibility is that G.E. Kincaid was a real person, a genuine explorer who actually did travel the Colorado River and actually did find something remarkable in the Grand Canyon, but who operated so far outside the established networks of professional exploration that he left no trace in the official records. This isn't impossible. The American West in 1909 still had remote corners that few outsiders had ever visited. A solitary adventurer, someone without institutional backing or professional credentials, could potentially spend years exploring those regions without ever generating the kind of documentation that historians would later search for. There were plenty of unconventional characters roaming the deserts and canyons during that era, people who lived outside the boundaries of mainstream society, people whose lives were never recorded in any archive. Kincaid could have been one of them, a loner, a drifter, someone who stumbled into an extraordinary discovery entirely by accident, and then vanished back into the obscurity from which he had emerged. But this possibility raises difficult questions. If Kincaid was really operating independently, without government employment or institutional support, then why did the Phoenix Gazette article specifically describe him as being employed by the federal government and working under Smithsonian auspices? Those claims weren't ambiguous. They were stated directly and clearly. If they were fabricated, then someone, either Kincaid himself or the newspaper's writer, made a deliberate decision to attach false institutional credentials to the story. That kind of fabrication would significantly undermine the credibility of the entire account. Why invent government backing if the discovery was genuine? Why add details that could be easily disproven by anyone who bothered to check with the Smithsonian? The second possibility is that G. E. Kincaid was not a real person at all, but rather a pseudonym, a fabricated identity created to give the story a human face and a sense of personal testimony. This was a common technique in newspaper hoaxes of the era. Writers would invent fictional witnesses, complete with names and backgrounds, to add credibility to otherwise implausible tales. A named witness feels more real than an anonymous claim. Readers naturally assume that if a specific person is being cited, that person must exist, that someone could theoretically track them down and verify their statements. In practice, of course, no one ever did track down the witnesses in these stories. Newspapers didn't have the resources or the motivation to verify their own sensational claims, and readers didn't have the means or the inclination to conduct independent investigations. A fabricated name served its purpose simply by existing. It made the story feel more grounded, more credible, more like actual news rather than pure invention. If Kincaid was a pseudonym, then the choice of name itself might carry clues. G. E. Kincaid, generic enough to sound like a real person, specific enough to feel authentic. The initials G.E. suggest a full name lurking behind them. George Edward, perhaps, or Gilbert Elias, something conventional and believable. The surname Kincaid has a faintly adventurous quality, a slight suggestion of Scottish Highland ruggedness, without being obviously fictional. It's the kind of name a newspaper writer might invent if they wanted their imaginary explorer to sound like exactly the sort of person who would venture alone into uncharted canyons and emerge with tales of ancient wonders. The third possibility is the most straightforward and perhaps the most likely. That the entire article was a newspaper fabrication, a story invented from whole cloth by the Phoenix Gazette, or by a contributor to that publication, designed to entertain readers and boost circulation during a period when sensational tales of exploration and discovery were enormously popular. Under this interpretation, Kincaid is simply a character in a fictional narrative, no more real than the mummies and hieroglyphs described inside his imaginary cave. The government employment, the Smithsonian connection, the years of prior exploration, all of these details were invented to give the story weight and plausibility. They were narrative devices, not factual claims, and the absence of any corroborating evidence for Kincaid's existence is simply confirmation that he never existed at all. Each of these possibilities has its proponents. Each has its problems. And none of them can be conclusively proven or disproven based on the available evidence. The man at the centre of this mystery remains stubbornly, frustratingly elusive, a name without a history, a witness without a background, a figure who stepped out of the shadows of an April morning newspaper, made a single extraordinary claim, and then disappeared so completely that it's as if he never existed at all. Except, of course, for that article, that one surviving piece of printed paper that insists, with all the confidence of bold newspaper type, that someone named G.E. Kincaid really did travel down the Colorado River, really did find a cave in the Grand Canyon, and really did discover something inside it that the world needed to know about. Whether that someone was a real explorer, a convenient pseudonym, or a pure fabrication, the story he told or was told about him has proven remarkably durable. And it all begins with that supposed journey down the river. So let's follow that journey. Let's trace the path that the story describes, moving from the frustrating absence of Kincaid's identity into the equally murky territory of his alleged expedition. Because whether Kincaid was a real person, a pseudonym, or a complete invention, the narrative of his voyage down the Colorado River is where this tale transforms from a vague claim into something vivid and tangible. It's where the story starts to breathe. According to the Phoenix Gazette account, Kincaid was travelling alone in a small wooden boat, navigating the Colorado River through the heart of the Grand Canyon. Picture that for a moment. A single man, no crew, no support team, just one figure in a modest vessel, making his way through one of the most formidable natural landscapes on the planet. The Colorado River in 1909 was not the tamed, regulated waterway that exists today, controlled by dams and carefully monitored by agencies. It was a wild, unpredictable force. The canyon walls rose sheer on either side, towering thousands of feet overhead, blocking out the sky in places and creating a world of shadow and stone that felt entirely removed from human civilization. The river itself was dangerous, full of rapids, sudden drops, and hidden rocks that could swallow a small boat in seconds. Major John Wesley Powell's famous first descent of the canyon in 1869 had demonstrated just how treacherous this journey could be. Powell lost boats, supplies, and nearly his life navigating those same waters, and he had a crew of experienced men. The idea of a lone traveller making this same journey in a small wooden boat, handling all the physical demands of navigation and survival by himself, requires either extraordinary skill or extraordinary luck, or perhaps a bit of both. But the story insists that this is what Kincaid did. Day after day, supposedly he worked his way downstream, passing through sections of the canyon that few outsiders had ever seen. The Gazette describes him travelling alone, which is a crucial detail for the narrative. A lone explorer is romantic, self-reliant, heroic. He doesn't have to coordinate with companions or follow institutional protocols. He can stop whenever he wants, investigate whatever catches his eye, and make decisions based entirely on his own curiosity and instinct. This solitude also conveniently eliminates the need for corroborating witnesses. No companions means no one to contradict the account later, no one to provide alternative versions of events, no one to confirm or deny what was really seen in those remote canyon walls. It's a narrative arrangement that serves the story perfectly while making independent verification essentially impossible. Then comes the pivotal moment. Kincaid, travelling along this immense and forbidding stretch of river, notices something unusual. The Gazette article places the discovery roughly 42 miles upstream from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon, a reference point that contemporary readers might have recognized, but which modern researchers have found difficult to pin down with precision. What Kincaid allegedly observed was an opening in the canyon wall, a cave entrance positioned high above the riverbank, far enough up the cliff face that it would have been invisible to casual observers and accessible only with considerable effort. This detail about the cave's location is important for several reasons. First, it explains why such a remarkable discovery had supposedly never been made before. A cave entrance situated high on a canyon wall, rather than at river level where travellers would naturally pass by, would remain hidden from anyone who wasn't specifically looking upward at exactly the right moment. The Grand Canyon's walls are riddled with crevices, alcoves, and shallow depressions that could resemble cave entrances from certain angles. Most of these are natural geological features, erosional pockets carved by wind and water over millions of years. Spotting a genuine deep cave among all these surface irregularities would require either deliberate searching or an extraordinary accident of perspective. The story gives Kincaid both. He's portrayed as an experienced explorer who would notice things others might miss, and he's placed in a position where such a discovery could happen by chance. Reaching a cave entrance positioned high above the river would present significant physical challenges. The canyon walls in many sections of the Grand Canyon are nearly vertical, smooth stone faces that offer few handholds or footholds for climbing. Without modern equipment, ascending even a moderate distance above the river would require finding a section of wall with natural ledges, erosion steps, or other features that could support a careful climb. The Gazette article doesn't describe how Kincaid supposedly reached the entrance. It simply states that he found it and entered. This omission is characteristic of the entire account. The story provides dramatic conclusions without explaining the practical steps required to achieve them. How does a lone man in a small boat secure his vessel while climbing an unknown cliff face? How does he assess the safety of a cave entrance he's never seen before? How does he manage the physical demands of climbing while carrying whatever supplies he might need for exploration? These practical questions remain unaddressed, which is either a sign of narrative economy or a sign that the story wasn't constructed with genuine expedition logistics in mind. But the narrative continues, and here is where the atmosphere thickens. Kincaid, having reached the cave entrance, steps inside. He moves from the bright, harsh daylight of the canyon into the sudden darkness of an unknown passage. The transition would have been immediate and dramatic. The desert sun in the Grand Canyon is intense, blinding in its brightness, and stepping from that light into the profound darkness of a cave interior would require moments of adjustment, the eyes struggling to make sense of the sudden absence of illumination. In those first seconds, details would be minimal, perhaps the faint shape of a passage extending inward. Perhaps the sound of air moving through stone corridors, suggesting depth and openness beyond the entrance. Perhaps the smell of a space that has been sealed for a very long time, that particular quality of stillness that ancient enclosed places carry, the air heavy with dust and time. The story tells us that what Kincaid found inside was extraordinary. A vast network of tunnels and chambers, carved with precision and regularity that suggested human construction rather than natural formation. Artifacts scattered throughout, copper implements, weapons, tools, objects made from materials not typically associated with the indigenous peoples of the American Southwest. Mummies, carefully preserved and arranged. Hieroglyphs inscribed on walls resembling writing systems found in distant parts of the world. An idol sitting at the end of a passage, carved from stone and depicting a figure that seemed to belong to another continent entirely. Each of these discoveries, taken individually, would be remarkable. Taken together, they constitute an archaeological revelation that would fundamentally challenge understanding of pre-Columbian North America. And this is precisely where the narrative's compelling quality intersects most sharply with its questionable aspects. Because the story of Kincaid's journey down the Colorado and his discovery of the cave is constructed with elements that make it deeply absorbing as a tale. The lone explorer, the hidden entrance, the dramatic descent into darkness, the astonishing revelations waiting inside. These are the ingredients of classic adventure narratives, the kind of stories that have captivated human imagination for centuries. They tap into fundamental desires, the longing for discovery, the fascination with hidden knowledge, the hope that somewhere in the vast unexplored corners of the world, something extraordinary still waits to be found. The Grand Canyon itself provides a perfect backdrop for such a narrative. Its immense scale, its visual drama, its genuine archaeological significance, all of these real qualities lend credibility to a fictional story set within its boundaries. When you hear about a remarkable discovery in the Grand Canyon, the setting itself makes the claim feel more plausible. The canyon is enormous and largely inaccessible. Who could say with certainty what might be hidden in its remote sections? But these same dramatic elements also function as warning signs. The lone witness with no corroborating companions. The perfectly timed discovery of something that exactly matches contemporary fantasies about ancient civilizations. The absence of practical details about how the discovery was actually achieved. The complete lack of physical evidence that has ever been presented. These patterns appear repeatedly in stories that ultimately prove to be fictional. They don't conclusively demonstrate that the Kincaid story is false, but they do suggest that its narrative structure aligns more closely with invented tales than with documented historical events. The journey down the Colorado, as described in the Gazette, is a story that feels designed to be told, designed to captivate, designed to leave listeners wanting more information that will never arrive. And that quality, that sense of a narrative crafted for maximum effect rather than maximum accuracy, haunts the entire mystery, like an echo rolling through empty canyon corridors. So let's step through that entrance with him. Let's move from the blinding canyon daylight into the profound darkness beyond, and examine what the Gazette article claims Kincaid found once his eyes adjusted to the shadows. Because the description of the cave's interior is where this story shifts from an account of a lone explorer's lucky discovery into something far more elaborate, far more structured, and far more difficult to reconcile with what we know about the natural formation of caves. The article describes a vast network of tunnels and chambers, not a simple cavern or a single hollow space carved by water and erosion over millennia, but an extensive interconnected system of passages that reportedly extended hundreds of feet into the canyon wall. The scale alone is striking. Most natural caves in sandstone and limestone formations are irregular, winding affairs. They follow the path of least resistance as water slowly dissolves and erodes the rock over thousands of years. They bulge where the stone is softer, narrow where the stone is harder, twist and turn following geological seams and fault lines. They don't typically produce the kind of regular, systematic layout that the Gazette describes. According to the account, what Kincaid encountered was something altogether different. The passages were reportedly narrow but consistent in their dimensions, long corridors carved through the rock with a uniformity that suggested deliberate construction rather than natural erosion. These narrow passageways would then open unexpectedly into large chambers, spaces wide enough to stand comfortably, tall enough that the ceilings disappeared into shadow above. The transition from confined corridor to expansive room is described as sudden, a design feature that would serve practical purposes if the space were intended for habitation or storage. Narrow passages are easier to defend, easier to monitor, easier to control access through. Large chambers provide space for gatherings, for storage, for activities that require room to move. This kind of architectural logic, the deliberate alternation between restricted and open spaces, is characteristic of human construction. It appears in ancient temples, in fortified compounds, in underground cities like those found in Turkey and Iran. It does not typically appear in natural cave systems. Then there are the ventilation shafts. The Gazette claims that these were present throughout the tunnel network, vertical passages connecting the underground chambers to the surface above, allowing fresh air to circulate deep inside the rock. This detail is particularly significant because ventilation is one of the primary engineering challenges in constructing any underground habitat. Without airflow, enclosed spaces quickly become uninhabitable. Carbon dioxide builds up, stale air accumulates, moisture condenses on cold stone surfaces, creating conditions that promote decay and make sustained human occupation difficult. The presence of ventilation shafts implies that whoever built these tunnels, if they were indeed built, understood this challenge and engineered a solution. It implies forethought, planning, architectural knowledge applied to a practical problem of survival and comfort in an underground environment. And this is where the narrative begins to exert its strongest pull on the imagination. Because these architectural details, the regular passages, the strategic chambers, the engineered ventilation, they accumulate into a portrait of something that feels intentional, something designed. The story presents a space that doesn't just shelter people passively, like a natural cave that happens to be dry and accessible, but a space that was constructed to serve specific functions. This distinction matters enormously. A natural cave can be impressive, vast, beautiful, certainly. But a constructed underground network implies something different entirely. It implies a civilization with the organizational capacity to plan large-scale building projects. It implies a population large enough to require such extensive habitation space. It implies engineering knowledge sophisticated enough to solve problems of structural stability, air circulation, and light provision in an enclosed underground environment. It implies, in short, a level of cultural and technological development that would be extraordinary for any period in North American prehistory, and virtually incomprehensible for the indigenous peoples known to have inhabited the Grand Canyon region. These claims fueled theories about an advanced ancient civilization precisely because they point toward capabilities that don't fit neatly into established archaeological understanding. If the tunnels and chambers were real, and if they showed the kind of construction evidence the article describes, then someone with significant engineering skill built them. That someone would represent a gap in the historical record, a culture or civilization whose existence, achievements, and eventual disappearance had left no other trace beyond this single, hidden, supposedly inaccessible underground complex deep in the Grand Canyon. The architectural details became the foundation for speculation about Egyptian connections, about lost Atlantis colonies, about ancient migrants from Asia or the Mediterranean, who supposedly crossed oceans millennia before such voyages were thought possible. The logic, however strained, was straightforward enough. The tunnels looked engineered, the chambers looked designed. The ventilation looked planned. Therefore, the builders must have been engineers, designers, planners. Therefore, they must have come from a civilization that possessed such knowledge. And since no known North American culture possessed such knowledge at the relevant time period, that civilization must have originated elsewhere. But standing against all of this compelling architectural detail is a silence that the story cannot overcome. There are no photographs. Not a single image exists showing the tunnel entrances, the chamber walls, the ventilation shafts, or any of the structural features that the Gazette describes with such specificity. In 1909, photographic equipment was widely available and commonly used by explorers documenting their discoveries. The absence of any visual documentation from a find of this magnitude is not just curious. It is fundamentally inconsistent with how genuine archaeological expeditions operate. Major discoveries are photographed, sketched, measured, catalogued. They produce visual records that allow other researchers to examine the evidence without travelling to the site themselves. The Kincaid cave produced none of these records. No floor plans, no section drawings, no photographs of the passages or chambers, no images of the ventilation shafts or the construction evidence that supposedly proved human origin. The entire architectural description exists only as words in a newspaper article, unsupported by any form of physical documentation that could be examined, verified, or studied by independent investigators. The tunnels and chambers remain, in every meaningful sense, purely textual constructs, places that exist only on the page, in the imagination of anyone who reads the description and tries to picture what such a network might look like if it were real. This absence doesn't disprove the story, but it does leave the architectural claims suspended in a peculiar state, detailed enough to be vivid, specific enough to be compelling, but entirely lacking in the kind of evidence that would allow those details to be assessed on their merits, rather than on their narrative appeal. And then there were the objects, the cave's architecture, those tunnels and chambers and ventilation shafts, told a story of engineering and design. But the artifacts supposedly found within those chambers told a different story entirely. A story of craft, of ritual, of daily life carried out deep underground by people whose hands worked materials in ways that, according to the account, bore no resemblance to anything known from the indigenous cultures of the American Southwest. The Phoenix Gazette article described copper implements, not crude copper, not the kind of roughly worked metal that occasionally appears in late-period Native American sites after European contact, introduced smelting techniques, but refined, shaped copper. Tools and weapons crafted with a level of precision that the article suggested was unexpected, even shocking in this context. Copper spears, copper axes, copper knives with edges that hinted at deliberate, skilled tempering rather than simple hammering. The distinction matters. Native peoples in the Americas did work copper, particularly in the Great Lakes region where raw copper nuggets could be found and cold hammered into ornaments and simple tools. But that copper work was limited. It was decorative, ceremonial, supplemental. It never replaced stone and bone as the primary materials for weapons and implements. It never developed into the kind of systematic metalworking that produces standardized tools with consistent shapes and reliable edges. The copper objects described in the Gazette article, however, were presented as exactly that kind of product. Functional implements designed for practical use, shaped with apparent skill, found in quantities that implied routine manufacture rather than occasional experimentation. Then there were the weapons. The article mentioned spear points and arrowheads, but again, the description diverged from expectations. These weren't the chipped stone points that archaeologists have catalogued by the thousands across North America, each one identifiable by its style, its material, its manufacturing technique, each one fitting neatly into established classification systems that map the spread and development of indigenous cultures over thousands of years. The weapons in the cave were described as different materials, different designs, different construction methods. They didn't fit the patterns. They didn't match any known typology. They existed, at least in the telling, outside the entire framework that archaeologists had built to understand the peoples who lived in this region before European contact. And the tools, implements for cutting, scraping, drilling, grinding, the everyday objects that any sustained human habitation would require. The Gazette account described these in terms that suggested sophistication rather than simplicity. Not just sharpened stones or carved bones, but tools that seemed designed for specific purposes with specific forms, the kind of specialization that emerges when a craft tradition develops over time, when knowledge accumulates across generations, when makers refine their techniques through repetition and incremental improvement. This kind of tool diversity and specialization appears in the archaeological record when cultures reach certain thresholds of complexity. It appears in ancient Mesopotamia, in early Egyptian communities, in the Neolithic cultures of Europe and Asia. It does not, according to established understanding, appear in the prehistoric Southwest in the manner described. But perhaps the most intriguing category of objects was the one the article identified as ceremonial or religious. These were described separately from the practical implements, set apart by their form and apparent purpose. Vessels that seemed designed for ritual rather than utility. Objects whose shapes suggested symbolic meaning rather than functional use. Items that carried what the article called engravings, patterned markings that looked like they might represent something beyond pure decoration, something encoded, deliberate, communicative. The presence of ceremonial objects implies a culture with organized spiritual practices, not just individual superstitions or vague animistic beliefs, but formalized ritual, traditions that require dedicated objects, dedicated spaces, dedicated practitioners. It implies a society with enough structural complexity to support specialized roles, people whose primary function was not hunting or gathering or building, but mediating between the visible and invisible worlds. This is the kind of cultural development that leaves substantial archaeological traces. Temples, shrines, burial deposits, with consistent ritual elements, standardized religious iconography that appears across multiple sites. The ceremonial objects in the cave, if they existed as described, would point toward precisely this kind of organized spiritual life, and that pointing is exactly what made them so problematic for conventional understanding, and so provocative for alternative theories. Because here is where the artifact descriptions intersect with the architectural ones. to create the story's most enduring tension. The objects described in the Gazette article were presented as fundamentally different from known Native American craftsmanship. Different in material, different in technique, different in design logic, different in cultural context. Copper implements that exceeded expected metalworking capabilities, weapons that didn't match established typologies, tools that suggested craft specialization beyond what the regional archaeological record supports, ceremonial objects that implied organized religious practice of a kind not documented among the indigenous peoples of the canyon. Each of these claims, taken individually, would be unusual. Taken together, they construct a portrait of a culture that doesn't fit. A culture whose material output doesn't align with any known indigenous tradition. A culture that appears, at least in this description, to have emerged from a different lineage, a different knowledge base, a different set of influences and ancestors. This is precisely why the artifacts fueled theories about a mysterious, non-indigenous origin. The logic was straightforward, even if the conclusions were speculative. If the objects don't match known Native American craft traditions, then either those traditions were more diverse and sophisticated than current evidence suggests, which is always possible. Archaeology discovers new things regularly, or the objects originated from a different cultural source entirely. A source that brought metalworking knowledge, weapon design principles, tool specialization, and ritual practices that had no documented precedent in the Americas. A source from somewhere else, across an ocean. From a civilization that already possessed these capabilities and somehow transported them, or the knowledge of them, to this isolated underground chamber in the Grand Canyon. The artifact descriptions became evidence for the Egyptian theories, the Asian migration theories, the lost Atlantis theories, precisely because they were described in terms that made them sound unlike anything indigenous to this continent. They became the material proof for a cultural intrusion, objects that supposedly demonstrated the presence of outsiders, whose skills and traditions exceeded what the local peoples were thought to possess. But then we encounter that same silence again, that same absence that shadows every aspect of this story. Not a single artifact from the Kincaid cave has ever been produced. No copper implements have been examined by metallurgists. No weapons have been analysed by archaeologists specialising in prehistoric armaments. No tools have been measured, catalogued, compared to known specimens. No ceremonial objects have been studied by experts in ancient ritual practice. None. The entire collection of artifacts described in the Gazette article, every spear point, every axe head, every engraved vessel, every ritual item, exists purely as description, words on newsprint, claims in a story. They have never been photographed, never been sketched, never been held in anyone's hands since that article was published. No museum holds them, no university collection contains them. No private collector has ever displayed them. The Smithsonian, which the article claimed received these objects for study, has repeatedly and consistently denied that any such collection ever entered their institution. They have searched their records, their catalogues, their storage facilities, and found nothing. Not a trace, not a reference, not a single entry that corresponds to artifacts from a cave in the Grand Canyon discovered by someone named Kincaid in 1909. The artifacts, like the tunnels and chambers that supposedly house them, remain purely textual. Objects that exist only in language, only in the space between words and imagination. Detailed enough to seem real, specific enough to seem credible, but entirely unsupported by any physical evidence that could confirm their existence, verify their description, or allow independent assessment of their origin and significance. And then there were the mummies. The Gazette article didn't just describe empty chambers and abandoned artifacts. It described remains, human remains, specifically mummified bodies, preserved in a way that the account suggested was deliberate, intentional, the product of a cultural practice rather than accidental environmental conditions. The article claimed these mummies were found within the cave's chambers, positioned in ways that implied careful placement rather than random collapse or natural deposition. Not bodies left where they fell, but bodies arranged, prepared, treated with whatever methods this unknown culture had developed to prevent the normal processes of decay that follow death. Mummification is not universal. It doesn't happen everywhere or in every condition. It requires specific knowledge, specific techniques, specific environmental conditions, or some combination of all three. Natural mummification can occur in extremely dry environments where moisture is scarce and desiccation preserves soft tissue before decomposition can consume it. We see this in parts of Peru, in the arid regions of the American Southwest, in certain cave environments where constant temperature and humidity create conditions that slow biological breakdown. But natural mummification produces results that look accidental. Bodies shriveled and distorted by the drying process. Skin pulled tight against bone. Features collapsed and unrecognizable. The bodies preserved by nature don't look like they were meant to be preserved. They look like they were caught by circumstance, frozen in death by environmental accident rather than human intention. The mummies described in the Gazette article were different. The account suggested they were the product of deliberate preservation techniques that required understanding of how bodies decompose, which substances or processes could arrest that decomposition, which methods could maintain a recognizable human form after death. This kind of knowledge doesn't appear spontaneously. It develops over time through experimentation, observation, cultural transmission. It implies a tradition of death practices that extends beyond single individuals or isolated events. It implies a society that had formalized procedures for treating its dead, procedures that were learned, taught, refined, and applied consistently enough that multiple mummified remains could be produced using the same methods. The Egyptian comparison was inevitable. Ancient Egypt developed the most famous, most sophisticated mummification practices in human history. Their techniques involved removal of internal organs, treatment with natron salts, wrapping in linen, placement in decorated sarcophagi within elaborate tombs. The process required specialized knowledge, dedicated practitioners, and significant resources. It was a cultural institution, not just a practical technique. And when the Gazette article described mummified remains in a cave in the Grand Canyon, the connection leaped immediately to mind for readers who knew even the basics of ancient Egyptian practices. But the mummies weren't the only remains described in the account. There was something else, something that pushed the implications of this discovery in an even stranger direction. The article mentioned a statue, an idol, a carved figure described in terms that didn't point toward Egypt at all. The statue was said to resemble Eastern deities, figures associated with Asian religious traditions. The article's description invoked comparisons to Buddha, to representations of seated contemplative figures that occupy central positions in Buddhist and Hindu iconography across South and East Asia. A cross-legged figure, hands positioned in specific gestures, an expression of serene detachment rather than active power, the posture of meditation rather than the posture of authority. This was not an Egyptian god. This was not the kind of figure that would appear in temples along the Nile or in tombs decorated with hieroglyphic prayers to Osiris and Ra. This was something else entirely, something that pointed toward a different continent, a different religious tradition, a different cultural lineage. And this is where the contradictions become almost impossible to resolve. The same article that described mummified remains reminiscent of Egyptian burial practices also described an idol reminiscent of Asian religious iconography. The same cave that supposedly contained artifacts suggesting connections to the ancient Mediterranean also contained an object suggesting connections to the ancient East. two cultural signals pointing in opposite directions. Two distinct traditions occupying the same underground space. A culture that seemed to practice Egyptian-style preservation of the dead while simultaneously worshipping Asian-style deities. The description didn't blend these elements smoothly. It didn't present a syncretic tradition that combined Egyptian and Asian influences into something coherent and new. It presented them side by side, unexplained, unresolved, as if both traditions had somehow arrived in this isolated canyon intact and independent, rather than merging and adapting over time. This mixing of cultural markers created a portrait that defied conventional understanding of how civilizations develop and spread. Cultures influence each other through contact, trade, migration. When Egyptian traditions reached Mesopotamia, they adapted. When Asian religious concepts spread across Central Asia, they transformed. Syncretism produces hybrid forms, blended iconography, modified practices that show clear evidence of their multiple origins, while also showing the effects of local adaptation. But the cave's supposed contents didn't show this kind of gradual blending. They showed sharp contrasts, mummies that looked Egyptian alongside an idol that looked Asian, as if two complete, unrelated cultural packages had been transported simultaneously to the same remote location without any of the modifications that real cultural exchange produces. The public imagination seized on these contradictions precisely because they were so provocative. A mysterious lost race that combined elements of two ancient civilizations from opposite ends of the old world. A culture that didn't fit into any known category. A people whose practices and beliefs seemed to draw from sources that shouldn't have been available to them in prehistoric Arizona. The mummies and the idol became the story's most enduring symbols, the details that people remembered and repeated. The evidence that seemed to confirm this was something unprecedented, something that required extraordinary explanations precisely because it seemed so extraordinary. They captured the imagination because they suggested hidden connections between civilizations that conventional history treated as separate and independent. They implied contact, migration, influence across distances and barriers that seemed impassable for ancient peoples. They opened the door to theories about transoceanic travel, about cultural exchange that predated recorded history, about peoples whose movements and interactions had been lost to time and only now were being rediscovered in this underground chamber far from any ocean. But as with every other element of this story, the mummies and the idol remain entirely undocumented beyond the Gazette article. No museum record confirms their existence. No archaeological report describes their examination. No photograph shows their appearance. No specialist in mummification techniques has ever analysed their preservation methods. No expert in Asian religious iconography has ever assessed the idol's style or attribution. The mummies that supposedly demonstrated Egyptian-style burial practices and the idol that supposedly demonstrated Asian-style religious traditions exist only as descriptions in a single newspaper article. Descriptions that have never been corroborated by any independent source. Physical remains that have never been confirmed by any institution, any scholar, any collection, any record outside that one story published on a spring morning in Phoenix in 1909. But the mummies and the idol weren't the only details pushing this story toward the impossible. The Gazette article contained another claim, one that seemed to seal the Egyptian connection with absolute certainty. Hieroglyphs, carved writing, symbols etched directly into the cave walls themselves. Not random marks or natural scratches in the stone, but deliberate, organized inscriptions. Patterns that repeated, characters that appeared to form sequences that looked like language. The article described these carvings as hieroglyphic, using that specific word, the word that immediately conjures one civilization above all others. Ancient Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, the civilization that built pyramids along the Nile and covered the walls of its tombs and temples with precisely this kind of writing. Picture language, symbol language, birds and eyes and reeds and seated figures arranged in rows and columns, telling stories of gods and kings and journeys to the afterlife. The word hieroglyph carries enormous cultural weight. When people in 1909 read that hieroglyphs had been found in a cave in the Grand Canyon, they didn't think about symbolic writing systems in general. They didn't consider the countless indigenous cultures across the Americas that developed their own forms of pictographic communication. They thought about Egypt, specifically and exclusively about Egypt. The association was instant and unavoidable. Hieroglyphs meant Egypt. Egypt meant hieroglyphs. The two concepts had been linked in the Western mind for over a century, ever since Napoleon's campaigns brought Egyptian antiquities to European attention, ever since scholars like Champollion finally cracked the code of the ancient script and opened up millennia of lost history. By 1909, Egypt was everywhere in the popular imagination. Museum exhibitions displayed mummies and sarcophagi. Adventure novels featured explorers discovering hidden tombs. The opening of spectacular burial sites filled newspapers with tales of gold and curses and civilizations that had risen and fallen while Europe was still covered in forest. So, when the Gazette article mentioned hieroglyphic writing in an underground chamber in Arizona, readers immediately constructed a mental bridge across the Atlantic. The mummies already suggested Egyptian burial practices. The carved writing seemed to confirm Egyptian cultural identity. Together, these details painted a picture of an Egyptian colony, or an Egyptian expedition, or an Egyptian influence somehow reaching the heart of the North American continent, thousands of years before Columbus, before the Vikings, before any documented transoceanic contact whatsoever. The implications were staggering. If Egyptians had travelled to the Grand Canyon, if they had established a presence deep enough to leave elaborate underground chambers and inscribed walls and mummified remains, then the entire understanding of ancient history would need fundamental revision. The oceans weren't barriers, they were highways. Civilizations separated by thousands of miles of open water weren't isolated. They were connected, and the connections happened far earlier, far more frequently than any mainstream scholar would acknowledge. This idea didn't emerge from nowhere. Diffusionist theories were popular in the early 20th century. Scholars and amateur archaeologists alike looked for similarities between distant cultures and interpreted those similarities as evidence of direct contact. A pyramid in Mexico resembled a pyramid in Egypt. Therefore, Egyptians must have influenced Mesoamerican builders. A symbol in India resembled a symbol in Peru. Therefore, some ancient migration had carried the symbol across the Pacific. Diffusionists believed that significant cultural innovations rarely developed independently. They assumed that invention was rare and imitation was common, that peoples learned from each other rather than developing similar solutions to similar problems on their own. These theories appealed to a generation fascinated by lost civilizations, by the possibility that history contained hidden chapters, secret connections, undiscovered migrations that had reshaped cultures across the globe before fading from memory entirely. The early 1900s were prime territory for these ideas. The century had barely begun, and already it had revealed how much remained unknown. Archaeological discoveries were transforming understanding of the ancient world at a pace that felt almost disorienting. Troy was found. Minoan civilization emerged from Crete. Babylonian ruins yielded libraries of cuneiform tablets. Each discovery suggested that more surprises waited beneath the soil, that civilizations could rise, flourish, and vanish so completely that even their names disappeared from human memory. If Troy could be lost and found, why not an Egyptian outpost in the Americas? If the Minoans could build a palace civilization and then collapse into obscurity, Why not a similar story playing out in the canyons of Arizona? The diffusionist mindset thrived in this atmosphere of revelation and possibility. It offered a framework for interpreting unexpected similarities across vast distances. It provided an explanation that felt logical, even inevitable, for connections that conventional scholarship dismissed as coincidence or independent development. But mainstream archaeology found no evidence supporting these connections. None. Not in 1909 and not in the century that followed. The hieroglyphs described in the Gazette article have never been documented, never been photographed, never been examined by any specialist in Egyptian writing systems. No Egyptologist has ever confirmed that authentic Egyptian hieroglyphs exist anywhere in the Americas. No archaeological site in North or South America has produced artifacts that demonstrate direct Egyptian contact. No genetic studies of Native American populations show the kind of Near Eastern admixture that such contact would produce. The civilizations of the ancient Americas developed their own architectural traditions, their own writing systems, their own religious practices, their own agricultural technologies. They built pyramids because pyramids are structurally stable forms that any culture experimenting with monumental architecture might discover independently. They developed pictographic writing because representing ideas through images is a natural solution to the problem of communication across time and distance. The similarities that diffusionists interpreted as evidence of contact are better explained by parallel innovation. Different peoples facing similar challenges arriving at similar solutions through their own processes of experimentation and cultural evolution, not through mysterious ocean voyages carrying Egyptian priests to Arizona. And yet the hieroglyphs remain embedded in this story, an unverified claim in an unverified article describing an unverified cave, a detail that points toward one of history's most recognizable civilizations while lacking any corroborating evidence that such a connection ever existed. A piece of the puzzle that refuses to disappear despite the complete absence of proof, because it speaks to something deeper than evidence. It speaks to the desire for hidden connections, for secret histories, for the possibility that the world contains more mysteries than conventional scholarship has yet admitted. But the hieroglyphs weren't the only thread pulling this story toward credibility. The Gazette article named someone else, someone whose involvement seemed to transform the entire tale from a lone adventurer's tall story into an institutional undertaking. Professor S.A. Jordan, according to the article, Jordan was leading a Smithsonian-backed expedition to investigate Kincaid's discovery. Not just examining reports or reviewing photographs from afar, but physically traveling to the Grand Canyon, organizing a proper archaeological dig, bringing the authority and resources of one of America's most prestigious scientific institutions directly into the cave itself. This detail changed everything about how the story would be received. G.E. Kincaid, as we've discussed, was a figure whose identity remained stubbornly elusive. A lone explorer claiming a lone discovery in a remote wilderness could be dismissed, questioned, forgotten. But a professor, an academic, a scientist backed by the Smithsonian, that added an entirely different weight. It suggested that the discovery had been vetted, that serious people with serious credentials had taken it seriously, that the cave wasn't just one man's observation, but a subject of institutional investigation. So who was Professor S.A. Jordan? The answer, or rather the absence of an answer, tells its own story. Despite decades of researchers searching through Smithsonian archives, university records, academic directories, and published papers from the early 20th century, no verifiable information about S.A. Jordan has ever been found. No birth records, no death records, no employment files at the Smithsonian, no published research, no mentions in professional correspondence, no photographs, no trace whatsoever of a person matching this name and description existing in the academic landscape of 1909. The Smithsonian itself, when questioned about Jordan, has repeatedly stated that no such individual appears in their personnel records from that period. No professor named S.A. Jordan worked for them. No expedition under his leadership was authorized. No funding was allocated for investigating an underground discovery in the Grand Canyon. Jordan appears nowhere in the historical record except in the pages of the Phoenix Gazette article. He exists only within the narrative itself, a character created for the story, untraceable beyond it. Now, consider what this means if Jordan was fictional, if no such professor ever held a position at the Smithsonian or led an expedition to Arizona, then the institutional connection that seemed to anchor the story in reality dissolves entirely. The Smithsonian's involvement becomes as unverifiable as the hieroglyphs, as the mummies, as the cave itself. One layer of supposed credibility reveals itself to be another layer of uncertainty. But why invoke the Smithsonian at all? Why name a specific institution and a specific professor? The answer lies in how prestige functions in public perception. In 1909, the Smithsonian Institution occupied a position of extraordinary cultural authority. Founded in 1846, it had spent decades building a reputation as America's premier center for scientific research and knowledge preservation. Its museums housed national treasures. Its scientists led expeditions to every corner of the globe. Its publications were treated as authoritative records of discovery and scholarship. When people read that the Smithsonian was involved in something, they believed it. The institution's name carried a kind of gravitational weight that pulled any claim attached to it into the orbit of credibility. Invoking the Smithsonian wasn't just adding a detail to the story. It was deploying a powerful psychological tool. People trust institutions. They trust names they recognize. They trust authority figures with titles like professor and doctor and director. In an era before instant verification, before searchable databases and online archives, and the ability to confirm someone's credentials with a few keystrokes, institutional affiliations functioned as shorthand for legitimacy. You couldn't easily check whether S.A. Jordan actually worked at the Smithsonian. You couldn't pull up a staff directory or search digitized records. You read the name, you recognize the institution, and you made an assumption. A reasonable assumption given the context, but one that required no actual verification and left no easy path for challenge. This wasn't unique to the Grand Canyon story. The early 1900s saw numerous sensational claims that borrowed institutional authority to bolster their credibility. Discoveries of ancient artifacts were attributed to unnamed museum curators. Strange geological findings were linked to university geology departments. Medical breakthroughs were associated with respected hospitals or research institutes. The pattern was consistent and effective. A dramatic claim on its own might generate curiosity, but a dramatic claim connected to a respected institution generated belief. The Smithsonian's name was particularly valuable for this purpose, because the institution was genuinely involved in real archaeological work across the Americas. It funded expeditions to study ancient ruins. It employed scholars who investigated prehistoric sites. It published findings that reshaped understanding of Native American history and culture. So when a newspaper article mentioned Smithsonian involvement in a Grand Canyon discovery, the claim wasn't absurd on its face. It was plausible. The Smithsonian did send expeditions to the Southwest. It did study ancient cave dwellings. It did investigate sites that revealed unexpected chapters in the human story of North America. The fictional Jordan's supposed involvement echoed real Smithsonian activities, borrowing their legitimacy while departing from their actual work. This blurring of real institutional activity with invented specific details made the story harder to dismiss. The general framework was accurate. The specific application was fabricated. But for a reader encountering the article over breakfast in Phoenix, that distinction wasn't easy to make, and it wasn't easy to investigate. So what happens when you ask the Smithsonian directly? What happens when you walk through the doors of their archives, submit a formal inquiry, or simply call their public affairs office and ask about GE, Kincaid, Professor S.A. Jordan, and an underground citadel filled with Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon? You get a denial, a clear, unequivocal, consistent denial that has been repeated for over a century. The Smithsonian Institution's modern-day position on the 1909 story is straightforward. They have no record of any such expedition. They have no record of any employee or associate named G.E. Kincaid. They have no record of any Professor S.A. Jordan. They have no artifacts, no photographs, no field notes, no correspondence, no funding allocations, no shipment records, nothing whatsoever that supports, references, or even acknowledges the existence of the cave described in the Phoenix Gazette. Every inquiry, whether from amateur historians, curious tourists, academic researchers, or investigative journalists, receives essentially the same response. The Smithsonian did not investigate this discovery. The Smithsonian has no knowledge of this discovery. The Smithsonian has no records pertaining to this discovery. The story, as far as the institution is concerned, never happened. This denial isn't a recent development or a defensive posture adopted after years of pressure. The Smithsonian has been disavowing the story since the earliest inquiries were made. Their archives have been searched repeatedly by staff and by outside researchers, and every search has returned the same result. Empty, no trace. The institutional memory contains no whisper of Kincaid or Jordan or an Egyptian cave in Arizona. The massive archival system that preserves correspondence, expedition logs, personnel files, budget records, specimen inventories, and administrative documents from the early 20th century has no gap where such records might have existed and been removed. There is simply nothing there. The absence is complete. For an institution like the Smithsonian, this kind of persistent public inquiry is unusual but not unprecedented. They receive questions about all manner of historical legends, conspiracy theories, and popular myths. Some are more persistent than others. The Grand Canyon cave story has proven remarkably durable, generating regular inquiries decade after decade, and each inquiry requires a response. Why? Because institutions have a responsibility to address public questions about their history and activities. When people ask whether the Smithsonian investigated something, whether they possess certain artifacts, whether they funded certain expeditions, the institution must answer, not just for the sake of accuracy, though that matters, but because silence can be interpreted as confirmation. If the Smithsonian simply ignored questions about Kincaid and Jordan, some would inevitably conclude that they were hiding something, that the absence of a response amounted to an admission. So they deny, consistently, patiently, repeatedly. It has become a routine part of their public communication, a small but persistent footnote in their institutional history. But denial, no matter how consistent, rarely satisfies those who are already convinced. And this is where the story takes its most interesting turn. The Smithsonian's denial has not extinguished the legend. In many ways it has fueled it. Because for some people, an institutional denial isn't evidence that something didn't happen. It's evidence that something is being hidden. The conspiracy theories that have grown around the Smithsonian's response are elaborate and deeply rooted. The most common argument goes like this. The Smithsonian discovered something in that cave, something that challenged established understanding of human history, something that proved ancient Egyptians or another advanced civilization reached North America long before Columbus, something that rewrote the narrative of who built what and when. And rather than share this discovery with the world, rather than allow it to disrupt the comfortable timeline of mainstream archaeology, Rather than face the uncomfortable implications of evidence that contradicted everything they thought they knew, they buried it. They removed the artifacts. They destroyed the records. They silenced the witnesses. They erased the entire expedition from their archives and then spent the next century denying it ever occurred. This theory draws strength from a broader cultural suspicion of institutional authority. There's a persistent belief, not entirely without historical justification, that powerful organizations sometimes conceal information that would undermine their authority or challenge their established positions. Governments have classified documents. Universities have suppressed research. Corporations have hidden safety data. The idea that a museum, an institution dedicated to preserving and sharing knowledge, might instead choose to bury knowledge, feels to some people not just possible but plausible. After all, the Smithsonian is a government entity funded by Congress, embedded in the federal bureaucracy. If the government can keep secrets about military operations and intelligence activities, why wouldn't it keep secrets about archaeological discoveries that might destabilize historical narratives? Some versions of the conspiracy theory go further. They suggest that the Smithsonian didn't just hide the evidence but actively destroyed it. That artifacts were deliberately lost or broken, that photographs were burned, that field notes were shredded, that any physical trace of the cave and its contents was systematically eliminated. This is a more dramatic accusation, and one that requires believing not just in institutional secrecy, but in institutional vandalism, in the deliberate destruction of irreplaceable historical evidence by an organization whose entire mission is the preservation of such evidence. It requires believing that archaeologists and curators and museum directors, people who had spent their careers studying and protecting ancient artifacts, would instead choose to destroy them. That they would violate the fundamental ethic of their profession and their institution in order to maintain a particular version of human history. But here is where a more measured perspective becomes valuable. Absence of records is not proof of a cover-up. It is also not proof that records never existed. Both possibilities remain open, and both deserve consideration. The Smithsonian's archives, while extensive, are not infinite. They are not perfectly preserved. Documents have been lost over the decades through mundane processes. Administrative records from the early 1900s were not always considered worth permanent preservation. Budget allocations for minor expeditions might not have been documented with the same rigour as major undertakings. Correspondence between peripheral figures and institutional staff might never have been archived at all. The absence of records for Kincaid and Jordan could indicate that no such expedition occurred, which is the simplest and most likely explanation. But it could also, in a much less likely scenario, indicate that records were lost, discarded, or simply never created in the first place. That said, the scale of the absence in this case is significant. This isn't one missing memo or a single misplaced folder. If an expedition of the magnitude described in the Gazette article had actually occurred, if the Smithsonian had sent a team to investigate an underground city filled with artifacts from an unknown civilization, the documentary trail would have been substantial. Funding requests, authorization documents, shipping records for transported artifacts, published reports or at least internal summaries, press releases, photographs. The absence of all of these, not just one or two, makes the cover-up theory considerably harder to sustain. A conspiracy to erase such a discovery would require not just destroying records, but ensuring that no copy, no reference, no secondary mention survived anywhere in the institutional paperwork. And it would require doing this so thoroughly that subsequent searches by multiple independent researchers would find absolutely nothing. Not a whisper, not a hint, not a single anomalous document that suggests something was once there and is now gone. The cleanest absence in an archive is usually the absence that was never filled in the first place. Most records that don't exist never existed. They weren't removed. They weren't destroyed. They simply never came into being because the events they would have documented never occurred. This is the most likely explanation for the Smithsonian's empty archives regarding Kincaid and Jordan. But likelihood is not certainty, and in the space between what is most probable and what is conceivably possible, the legend continues to breathe. But likelihood is not certainty, and in the space between what is most probable and what is conceivably possible, the legend continues to breathe. To understand why this story took hold so deeply and why it refuses to let go even now, over a century later, you have to step back from the Grand Canyon itself. You have to step back from the Smithsonian's archives and the empty folders and the persistent denials. You have to look at the world that created this story. The world of American newspapers in the early 1900s. This was a different era for journalism, a different landscape entirely. The principles of factual reporting, of verification, of editorial oversight that we expect today, they existed in some form, but they were loose, flexible, often entirely optional. Newspapers were not primarily institutions of record. They were businesses, commercial enterprises competing for readers in a crowded and cutthroat market. And in that market, the currency that mattered most was attention. Not accuracy, not credibility, attention. The more readers a paper could attract, the more advertising revenue it could generate, the more financially secure its owners became. This created a powerful economic incentive to publish stories that grabbed people, that made them stop on the street, that made them buy a copy instead of walking past. And the stories that grabbed people most effectively were dramatic, sensational, mysterious, and extraordinary. The tradition of fabricated or heavily embellished journalism in America was not new in 1909. It had been thriving for decades. In the late 19th century, the phenomenon of yellow journalism had driven two major newspapers, those published by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, into a circulation war that prioritized spectacle over truth. Headlines were oversized, emotional, and often misleading. Stories were invented, exaggerated, or distorted to serve commercial and political interests. Illustrations were drawn to depict events that had never occurred, or had occurred in vastly different ways than shown. This wasn't considered a scandal by many readers. It was considered entertainment. People bought these papers expecting to be thrilled, not informed. The line between news and storytelling was thin, and it was frequently crossed without hesitation or consequence. Even before yellow journalism, there were notable hoaxes that captured the public imagination. In 1835, the New York Sun published a series of articles describing the discovery of life on the moon. Bat-like humanoids, unicorns, towering crystalline temples, all supposedly observed through a powerful new telescope by a real astronomer. The story was entirely fabricated, but it sold thousands of copies and was reprinted across the country before the deception was exposed. The Sun never suffered lasting reputational damage. If anything, the hoax boosted its profile and proved that invented stories could be enormously profitable. This lesson was not lost on other publishers. Then there was the case of the Cardiff Giant in 1869. A 10-foot stone figure discovered buried on a farm in New York, supposedly the petrified remains of an ancient giant. It was in reality a carved statue deliberately planted by a businessman who wanted to exploit the public's fascination with biblical accounts of giants. Thousands paid to view it. P.T. Barnum even created a copy when he couldn't acquire the original. The hoax was eventually revealed, but the profits had already been made, and the cultural memory of such stunts lingered in the minds of publishers who understood that audiences craved wonder far more than they demanded proof. By 1909, the overt excesses of yellow journalism had somewhat diminished, but the underlying incentives remained. Regional newspapers like the Phoenix Gazette operated in markets where competition for readers was fierce, and where dramatic stories about local wonders provided a distinct advantage. Arizona was still a territory then, not yet a state, a place that captured the national imagination as a land of desert mysteries, frontier adventures, and unexplored landscapes. Stories about strange discoveries in such places resonated deeply with readers across the country who were hungry for evidence that the world still contained hidden secrets, that the maps hadn't all been filled in, that somewhere out there, past the last settled town, beyond the reach of ordinary knowledge, extraordinary things still waited to be found. The Phoenix Gazette article about Kincaid's discovery fits squarely within this broader pattern of embellished or invented reporting. Its timing, its content, its tone, all align with the traditions of sensational journalism. The article appeared on a single day, April 5, 1909, and was never followed up. No subsequent investigation, no additional reporting, no verification or contradiction from other sources. It was published, it generated attention, and then it was left to stand alone, unexamined and unconfirmed by the very paper that had presented it as news. This is a common characteristic of newspaper hoaxes. They arrive with fanfare and then quietly disappear, leaving behind only the original text and the questions it raises. The article itself bears the stylistic marks of sensational storytelling. The language is dramatic, the claims are sweeping. An underground citadel, hundreds of rooms, artifacts suggesting Egyptian or Asian origins, a mysterious idol, mummified bodies, hieroglyphs. Each detail escalates the wonder, pushing further from plausible archaeological discovery and closer to adventure fiction. Yet the framing is journalistic. It presents these claims not as speculation or entertainment, but as reported fact, attributed to a named explorer and connected to a respected institution. This blurring of genres, this mixing of factual presentation with extraordinary content, was characteristic of the era's most successful hoaxes and sensational stories. Readers weren't given clear signals that they should approach the article with skepticism. They were given every signal that they should believe it. It's also worth noting the timing within the Gazette's own publication rhythm. The article appeared in the evening edition, a format that historically carried more speculative and sensational content than morning editions. Evening papers were designed to capture readers after the day's work was done, when they were relaxed, receptive, and looking for diversion rather than rigorous information. This context doesn't prove the article was fabricated, but it adds another layer to the circumstantial evidence, suggesting that the story was crafted more for engagement than for accuracy. The economic and cultural conditions that produce stories like the Kincaid article weren't unique to Arizona or to the Gazette. They were widespread structural features of American journalism at the time. Publishers faced constant pressure to maintain circulation. Readers faced a limited supply of reliable information and an abundant supply of competing claims, with few tools to distinguish between them. In this environment, stories that combine the authority of institutional references, like the Smithsonian name, with the thrill of mysterious discovery, like an underground Egyptian city, had enormous commercial value regardless of their truth. They sold papers, they generated buzz, they gave readers something to talk about over breakfast and at work and in the evening, and once published, they entered the cultural record, acquiring a permanence and a credibility that their original context never warranted. Understanding this context doesn't resolve the question of whether Kincaid's cave actually existed, but it does reframe how we evaluate the evidence. The single primary source for this entire legend is a newspaper article from an era when newspapers routinely published content that ranged from loosely verified to entirely invented, an era when economic incentives strongly favoured drama over accuracy. An era when the boundaries between news and storytelling were blurred enough that readers often couldn't tell the difference, and publishers often didn't care. The Gazette article might be an accurate report of a genuine discovery. It might be an embellished version of a real but less dramatic event. It might be a complete fabrication designed to sell papers on a slow news day. All three possibilities remain consistent with the historical context. The question is which possibility the available evidence most strongly supports. But even if the Kincaid story was fabricated, even if the underground citadel with its Egyptian hieroglyphs and mummified rulers never existed outside of a newspaper editor's imagination, that doesn't mean the Grand Canyon is empty of caves. Far from it. The canyon holds real caves, natural ones, formed by processes that operate on timescales so vast they make human civilization seem like a brief flicker of light in a long, dark room. And these genuine caves, though they contain no ancient idols and no copper weapons, have their own stories to tell. Stories written in stone and water and time. The Grand Canyon's cave systems exist because of the canyon's unique geology. The walls of the canyon are layered, stacked like a giant cake cut open by the Colorado River over millions of years. Each layer represents a different era, a different environment, a different set of conditions that prevailed when the rock was being formed. And among these layers there are units of limestone. Limestone is the key. It's a rock born from ancient seas, composed primarily of calcium carbonate, the accumulated shells and skeletons of marine organisms that lived and died in shallow oceans hundreds of millions of years ago. When those organisms died, their remains settled on the ocean floor, building up slowly, layer after layer, compacting over time into solid rock. This process took tens of millions of years. Entire epochs passed while these sediments accumulated. Seas advanced and retreated, climate shifted, evolution unfolded in the waters above while the limestone quietly grew below. Limestone has a particular vulnerability. It's soluble in weakly acidic water. Not quickly soluble, not like sugar dissolving in hot tea, but slowly, gradually over geological time. Rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and from soil as it percolates downward, becoming slightly acidic. When this acidic water encounters limestone, it begins to dissolve it, drop by drop, year by year, century by century. The process is almost imperceptibly slow from a human perspective. You could watch a limestone surface for your entire lifetime and see no visible change. But from a geological perspective, operating over hundreds of thousands or millions of years, this slow dissolution carves enormous voids. It hollows out chambers. It creates tunnels and passages and rooms that can extend for hundreds of feet into the rock. This is how the Grand Canyon's caves formed. Not by human hands, not by ancient civilizations, but by water and time working together with patient, relentless precision. The caves of the Grand Canyon are not like the massive show caves you might visit in other parts of the country. Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. Those are extensive systems with miles of mapped passages and enormous public chambers. The Grand Canyon's caves are different. They're smaller, more scattered, often harder to reach. This is partly because the canyon's limestone units are relatively thin compared to the massive limestone formations found elsewhere. The cave-forming layers here are sandwiched between other rock types, sandstones and shales, that don't dissolve in the same way. This constrains how large the caves can grow. They develop within specific geological horizons, limited by the boundaries of the soluble rock. The best known of these real caves is Cave of the Domes. It's located in the Redwall limestone layer, a prominent unit that forms some of the canyon's most distinctive cliff faces. Cave of the Domes was discovered in the late 19th century, one of the first Grand Canyon caves documented by explorers. Its name comes from the dome-shaped formations inside, created by the same dissolution processes that formed the cave itself. Water entering the cave over millennia has shaped the interior, leaving smooth surfaces, rounded projections, and the characteristic domes that gave the cave its name. It's a genuine natural formation, beautiful in its own right, and significant as an example of the kind of cave that actually exists within the canyon walls. But Cave of the Domes is just one of many. Over the decades, surveyors, geologists, and adventurers have identified numerous cave openings in the canyon's walls. Some are small, barely more than alcoves or shallow overhangs. Others are more substantial, extending deeper into the rock with multiple chambers and connecting passages. A few have been explored and mapped with some degree of thoroughness. Many more have only been glanced from a distance, their full extent unknown, their interiors unvisited by any documented explorer. The challenges of exploring these caves are considerable. The Grand Canyon is vast, over a mile deep in places, up to 18 miles wide, stretching for nearly 300 miles from end to end. Its walls are a maze of cliffs, ledges, slopes, and drop-offs that make access extremely difficult, even for experienced climbers. Many cave openings are visible from the river or from overlooks on the rim, but reaching them requires technical climbing skills, specialized equipment, and a tolerance for exposure that few people possess. Some caves are located in areas so remote that reaching them would take days of hiking through rugged, trailless terrain, carrying all necessary supplies with no guarantee of finding anything significant once you arrive. The river itself presents its own barriers. The Colorado River through the Grand Canyon is a powerful, unpredictable waterway. Its currents are strong, its rapids are dangerous. Its flow varies with seasons and dam releases upstream. Accessing caves along the river corridor requires either running the river itself, which involves significant logistical planning and risk, or approaching from the rim, which involves the extreme hiking and climbing challenges already described. Either way, the canyon doesn't welcome casual exploration. It demands commitment, preparation, and respect for its scale and its hazards. This difficulty of access is one reason why the canyon's caves have never been fully documented. Even today, in an era of satellite imagery, GPS mapping, and helicopter support, there are sections of the Grand Canyon that remain poorly surveyed from a speleological perspective, the study of caves. There are almost certainly cave openings that have never been recorded, passages that have never been entered, chambers that have never been measured or photographed. The canyon is simply too large, too complex, too difficult to navigate for any single effort or even any sustained program of exploration to have covered everything. And this is where a genuine mystery remains. Not the mystery of an ancient Egyptian city hidden underground, but the simpler, more grounded mystery of what else might be found in the canyon's limestone chambers if someone took the time and the risk to look. What formations might exist in caves no one has entered? What geological history might be recorded in walls no one has examined? What traces of the canyon's natural past might be preserved in spaces that water carved out over millions of years and that have remained undisturbed since? The real caves of the Grand Canyon don't contain mummies or copper tools. They don't hold hieroglyphs or secret idols. They hold something else. Evidence of deep time, records of ancient seas and slow dissolution. The quiet, patient work of water acting on stone across spans of time that dwarf all of human history. These caves are not less remarkable than the fictional one described in the Gazette article. They are remarkable in a different way, a way that doesn't require invented civilizations or sensational claims. A way that speaks to the actual documented, verifiable history of one of the most extraordinary landscapes on Earth. But the Grand Canyon's caves hold something else too. Not just the records of water and stone, but traces of actual people. Real people who lived in and around this landscape for thousands of years. People who left behind evidence that doesn't require newspaper sensationalism or invented Egyptian connections to be extraordinary. The genuine archaeological record of the Grand Canyon reveals a human history that is deeply complex, beautifully adapted, and genuinely ancient. It is a story written not in copper tablets or mummified rulers, but in split twig, in stone, in the careful architecture of granaries tucked into cliff walls, and in the enduring images painted and pecked onto rock surfaces across the canyon. Some of the most remarkable discoveries in the Grand Canyon are among the smallest. In the late 20th century, archaeologists exploring caves in the canyon's limestone formations found something unexpected. Tiny figurines, carefully crafted from single twigs of willow or other flexible wood, split down the middle and then bent and shaped into the forms of animals. Deer, bighorn sheep, mountain goats. These split-twig figurines, as they came to be known, are delicate. Some are just a few inches long. They look almost like toys, like something a child might make while sitting beside a fire. But their context suggests something more serious. They were found in caves, often placed in carefully constructed small enclosures of stone, sometimes arranged in groups. Some figurines were found with what appear to be spear points inserted into their bodies, as if they had been ritually hunted. These figurines date to over 4,000 years ago, possibly much older. They represent some of the earliest evidence of human symbolic behavior in the region. The people who made them were hunter-gatherers, living in a landscape that demanded intimate knowledge of animal movements, seasonal patterns, and available resources. The figurines suggest these people weren't just surviving. They were thinking symbolically. They were creating representations of the animals that sustained them, perhaps using them in rituals intended to ensure successful hunts, perhaps expressing a relationship with the natural world that went beyond mere utility. The exact purpose of the split-twig figurines remains debated. Archaeologists have proposed theories ranging from hunting magic to initiation ceremonies to simple artistic expression. We cannot know for certain what the makers intended, but we can know that these tiny objects represent something profound. The emergence of symbolic thought among people living in one of the most challenging environments on the continent. The split-twig figurines are just one piece of a much larger archaeological record. As centuries passed, the human presence in the Grand Canyon region grew more complex. The ancestral Puebloan people, sometimes called the Anasazi, though that term has fallen out of favor because it carries meanings that modern indigenous communities find problematic, established substantial communities in and around the canyon. They built dwellings, not the underground citadel described in the Gazette article, but real structures adapted to real conditions. Some were constructed on canyon rims, taking advantage of available farmland and water sources. Others were built in alcoves along the canyon walls, using the natural shelter provided by overhanging rock to protect against weather and enemies. The cliff dwellings of the Grand Canyon region are less dramatic than the famous structures at Mesa Verde or Canyon de Chelly. They're smaller, more scattered, often harder to reach. But they exist. Archaeologists have documented numerous sites containing the remains of rooms, storage structures, and communal spaces built from stone and mortar. These structures reflect careful engineering. The builders understood thermal dynamics, constructing walls that would retain heat in winter and stay cool in summer. They oriented dwellings to take advantage of sunlight and shade. They used locally available materials with impressive efficiency, selecting stones that fit naturally together, minimizing the need for extensive shaping or mortar. Among the most common structures found in the canyon are granaries, small, carefully constructed storage rooms built into cliff walls and alcoves. These granaries were essential for survival in a landscape where crop failures were possible and where storing surplus food could mean the difference between living through a difficult winter or not. They were built with tight-fitting stone walls sealed against rodents and moisture. Some still contain remnants of ancient corn, beans, and seeds, preserved for centuries by the dry, stable conditions inside. These are not the grandiose storage chambers of Kincaid's imaginary underground city. They are something more impressive in their own way. Practical, effective, carefully designed solutions to real problems created by people who understood their environment intimately and who passed that knowledge down through generations. Rock art adds another dimension to the archaeological record. Throughout the Grand Canyon and the broader region, surfaces of stone bear images created by ancient hands. Some were painted using pigments derived from minerals and organic materials. Others were pecked, using stones to chip away the darker surface patina of the rock and reveal lighter underlying material. These images include geometric patterns, human figures, animal forms, and abstract designs whose meanings remain uncertain. They span thousands of years, created by different cultural groups at different times for different purposes. Some may have been markers of territory or travel routes. Others may have been ceremonial or religious in nature. Some may simply have been expressions of the fundamental human impulse to create, to leave a mark, to say I was here. What all of these genuine discoveries reveal is a rich, layered human history in the Grand Canyon. Not a single lost civilization hidden in an underground vault, but countless generations of people adapting, building, creating, and surviving in a landscape that offered both extraordinary resources and extraordinary challenges. The archaeological record shows people who knew this place deeply, who developed technologies and social systems suited to its specific conditions, who maintained connections across distances through trade and kinship, and who left behind evidence of lives lived with intention and meaning. This documented record stands in sharp contrast to the claims made in the 1909 Gazette article. Those claims describe a single monumental discovery, a vast underground city with artifacts from a foreign civilization. But the real archaeological evidence describes something different, something more human, a cumulative history built by many hands over many centuries. Not one lost civilization, but many successive cultures, each contributing layers to the story, each adapting to the canyon's demands in their own ways. The genuine discoveries don't need Egyptian connections or mummified rulers to be remarkable. They are remarkable precisely because they are real, because they emerged from actual human experience in this specific landscape. Because they represent genuine ingenuity, genuine adaptation, genuine symbolic thought applied to genuine challenges. The split-twig figurines, the cliff dwellings, the granaries, the rock art. These are the true treasures hidden in the Grand Canyon stone. Not treasures of gold or copper, but treasures of knowledge and survival and human creativity persisting across millennia in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. But there is another kind of record in the Grand Canyon, one that doesn't leave physical traces the way split-twig figurines or stone granaries do, one that isn't carved into cliff walls or sealed in dry alcoves. This record lives in memory, in stories passed down across generations, carried by voices speaking languages that have echoed against this canyon's stone for far longer than any English newspaper has existed. The oral traditions of the indigenous peoples connected to the Grand Canyon offer something the 1909 Gazette article never could. Not a sensational tale of a mysterious foreign civilization conveniently hidden underground, but a deeply rooted, living understanding of this landscape and its origins. For the Hopi people, the Grand Canyon is not simply a dramatic geological feature. It is a place of emergence. Their oral traditions describe a time when their ancestors lived beneath the surface of the earth, in a world below this one. A series of worlds, actually. Each one destroyed when its people fell out of balance, when they forgot their responsibilities to the land and to each other. The first world was consumed by fire. the second by a great freezing, the third by a catastrophic flood. In each cycle, some people survived. They climbed upward, seeking the next world, guided by spiritual beings who showed them the way out of darkness and into light. The emergence into this, the fourth world, happened at a specific place. The Hopi call it Sipapu, and many traditions identify this place of emergence as lying within the Grand Canyon. Not in a vast illuminated underground city with copper doors and Egyptian hieroglyphs, but at a small, specific, deeply sacred location, a dome of stone rising from the canyon floor near the confluence of the Colorado and the Little Colorado rivers. A place that doesn't look spectacular to an outsider's eyes. It doesn't require torches or exploration gear, it requires reverence. The Sipapu is a portal between worlds in the Hopi understanding, a reminder of where people came from and why they are here. It connects the present moment to a deep ancestral past, stretching back through successive cycles of creation and destruction, teaching and forgetting, survival and renewal. Other tribal traditions hold the canyon sacred in their own ways. The Navajo, or Diné, tell stories of changing woman, a holy person who was born inside the canyon, who embodies the cycles of the earth itself. The canyon features prominently in Navajo ceremonial narratives, not as a discovery to be claimed, but as a living entity with its own spiritual presence. The Zuni people also carry traditions linking their ancestors to this region, describing journeys through landscapes that shaped their people physically and spiritually. The Hualapai, who have lived along the canyon's western reaches for centuries, understand it as their homeland. Not a place to explore, but a place to belong to. The Havasupai still live within the canyon itself, in a side canyon called Havasu, where turquoise-blue waters flow through their ancestral village. For them, the canyon is not a wonder of the world to visit. It is home. It is the center of their existence, the place where their stories began and where their identity continues to be formed. These oral histories describe ancestral journeys, migrations across vast distances guided by signs and spiritual directives. They tell of times when ancestors travelled across the landscape, seeking their proper place, carrying sacred objects, establishing villages, learning to farm in difficult terrain, enduring drought and conflict, and the slow accumulation of knowledge that would allow them to persist. The Grand Canyon appears in these narratives not as an obstacle to be conquered, but as a teacher, a place where difficult lessons were learned, where people were tested, where they discovered what they needed to know about living in balance with an unforgiving land. It is important to draw a clear and respectful line between these cultural narratives and the sensationalized legend of Kincaid's cave. The Hopi emergence story tells of a specific sacred place of spiritual significance. The Gazette article tells of an imaginary underground citadel filled with foreign treasures. These are fundamentally different kinds of stories. One arises from lived experience, from centuries of cultural continuity, from the intimate knowledge of people who have actually inhabited this landscape. The other arises from imagination, from the desire to find something mysterious and profitable, from the assumption that anything impressive found in North America must have come from somewhere else. The indigenous traditions of the Grand Canyon represent a different way of understanding the land entirely. Not as a resource to be extracted, or a puzzle to be solved, but as a relative, as an entity with its own history, its own presence, its own demands and gifts. These traditions don't ask whether an ancient civilization left copper tablets in a hidden vault. They ask how people should live here, what responsibilities they carry, what the land itself requires of those who inhabit it. They offer not just history, but ethics, not just knowledge about the past, but guidance for the present. This is what the genuine human record of the Grand Canyon provides. Not the thrill of a possible lost Egyptian colony hidden in stone, but something far more substantial. the accumulated wisdom of people who actually lived here, who faced the canyon's challenges directly, who developed ways of understanding and relating to this landscape that sustained them across centuries. The split-twig figurines and the cliff dwellings are the physical traces of that presence. The oral traditions are the living traces. Together they tell a story that doesn't need invention to be extraordinary. A story of real people in a real place, finding real ways to persist. The story of Kincaid's cave, with its vast underground chambers and mysterious foreign artifacts, does not exist in isolation. It belongs to a much older, much deeper tradition. A tradition of imagining lost civilizations and vanished peoples that stretches back through human storytelling as far as we can trace. When we hear about an advanced ancient culture hidden beneath the earth, something in us responds. Something reaches toward the possibility, and that response is not unique to the Grand Canyon, or to the early 20th century, or to the American West. It is a pattern that repeats across cultures, across centuries, across the entire globe. Consider Atlantis, the most famous lost civilization in Western tradition. Plato wrote about it around 360 BCE, describing a powerful, technologically advanced island nation that existed 9,000 years before his own time. A society with magnificent architecture, complex engineering, vast military power. A place that eventually grew corrupt, arrogant, and was destroyed in a single catastrophic day and night of destruction, sinking beneath the waves forever. Plato presented the story as a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale about the fate of societies that lose their moral foundation. But over the centuries, that allegory was transformed. People began searching for Atlantis, as if it were a real place. They proposed locations in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, off the coast of Antarctica, beneath the North Sea. Each theory mixed fragments of genuine geological or archaeological knowledge with layers of imaginative speculation. A submerged ancient settlement discovered near the Greek island of Santorini became evidence of Atlantis. An underwater rock formation near Bimini became the road to Atlantis. Real traces of real ancient places filtered through the lens of a myth that had grown far beyond its original purpose. The same pattern appears in South America. The story of El Dorado began as a specific ritual practiced by the Muisca people of what is now Colombia. A new ruler would cover himself in gold dust and paddle into a lake, offering precious objects to the spirits of the water. It was a ceremony, a cultural practice with genuine historical roots. But when Spanish conquistadors heard descriptions of this ritual, something shifted in the telling. The Golden Man became a golden city. The city became an empire. The empire became an entire civilization of unimaginable wealth, hidden somewhere in the vast, unexplored interior of the continent. Expeditions were launched. Rivers were followed into dense jungle. Men died searching for something that had never existed in the form they imagined. The real Muisca people, with their real culture and real gold-working traditions, were overshadowed by a fantasy that bore their name, but had little else to do with them. In Asia, similar narratives emerge. The Tibetan tradition of Shambhala describes a hidden kingdom deep in the mountains, a place of wisdom and spiritual advancement, accessible only to those who have purified their minds. This concept has genuine roots in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. It represents a spiritual ideal, a state of consciousness, a teaching about the path toward enlightenment. But in Western interpretations, Shambhala became Agartha, a physical underground city populated by an advanced ancient race, connected by tunnels that span continents, preserving knowledge that could transform the world. The philosophical concept was literalized, the spiritual was made physical, and once again, fragments of real cultural knowledge were woven together with imagination to create something that felt true without being accurate. Even in the indigenous traditions we just explored, There are elements that outsiders have sometimes misinterpreted in this way. The Hopi story of emergence from underground worlds describes a profound spiritual journey, cycles of growth and destruction and renewal. But some external commentators have read those narratives and imagined physical underground cities, vast subterranean chambers where ancient peoples actually lived in advanced civilizations. They take a story about spiritual transformation and treat it as a blueprint for hidden architecture. The meaning is lost, the surface details are preserved and expanded, and a tradition that was never meant to describe a lost civilization becomes evidence for one. Why does this happen so consistently? Why do human beings across so many different cultures and time periods keep generating these narratives about hidden, advanced ancient peoples? Part of the answer lies in genuine historical fragments. Real civilizations have collapsed. Real peoples have vanished. The Maya abandoned great cities that were then reclaimed by jungle. The ancestral Puebloan people left communities that stood empty for centuries. The Indus Valley civilization, one of the largest of the ancient world, faded away, leaving behind sophisticated ruins, but no clear explanation of what happened. When you encounter the remnants of a culture that once thrived and now exists only as stone walls and scattered artifacts, a question naturally arises. What happened to them? Where did they go? And could something like that happen to us? That question carries genuine weight. The mystery of collapsed civilizations is not frivolous. It reflects a real human concern about the fragility of complex societies, about the possibility that achievement and sophistication do not guarantee permanence. But the way that question gets answered in popular storytelling often transcends what the evidence supports. The ruins become more impressive. The disappearance becomes more dramatic. The lost people become more advanced than any known culture, possessing knowledge or technology that rivals or exceeds our own. A genuine historical puzzle is transformed into a narrative of revelation. The question shifts from what happened to these people to what secrets did they take with them, and that shift reveals something important about psychological appeal. Stories about lost civilizations promise something beyond historical knowledge. They promise discovery, the thrill of finding something hidden, something that changes our understanding of what is possible. They offer the sense that the world still contains secrets waiting to be revealed, that beneath the surface of ordinary life there are extraordinary truths. In a world where most landscapes have been mapped and most ancient sites have been catalogued, that promise feels increasingly scarce. And so the imagination reaches further. Underground cities, global tunnel networks, advanced peoples who understood technologies we have not yet rediscovered. The more we know about the actual past, the more elaborate the imagined alternatives become. This is the space where the Grand Canyon cave legend lives, not in the realm of verified archaeological discovery, but in the realm of narrative appeal. It combines real elements, a real place, a real newspaper, a real institution mentioned in the story, with imagined ones. The copper doors, the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the mummies arranged in underground vaults. It takes the genuine mystery of the Grand Canyon's deep time and vast scale and amplifies it into something even more dramatic. Something that feels like it could be true because the canyon itself is so extraordinary that extraordinary discoveries within it seem plausible. For those of you who find yourselves drawn to these themes, these intersections of genuine ancient mystery and the stories we build around them, we have explored them much more deeply in a book that examines prehistoric secrets and the ways they have shaped our understanding of the past. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. And there is a discount available this week if you're curious to continue this journey. The pattern is consistent. Real history provides the foundation. Genuine archaeological discoveries, actual cultural traditions, verified geological formations. Then imagination builds upon that foundation adding elements that satisfy a deep narrative desire. The desire for revelation, for hidden knowledge, for the possibility that the past contains wonders we have not yet uncovered. The Grand Canyon cave story is one expression of this pattern. Atlantis is another. El Dorado, Shambhala, the underground cities of legend, all are variations on the same persistent theme. And understanding why these stories emerge, why they persist, why they transform over time, tells us as much about ourselves as about the civilizations we imagine losing. It tells us that we are a species that looks at ruins and sees not just what was, but what might have been. A species that cannot resist the possibility that somewhere beneath the surface of the known world, something extraordinary is waiting to be found. So the pattern continues, and with it the search. Over the decades since the Phoenix Gazette article first appeared, modern investigators and enthusiasts have tried to locate Kincaid's lost cave. They have pored over the original text, looking for clues that might reveal its exact position. They have studied maps of the Grand Canyon, comparing the article's descriptions of river bends and landmark formations against the actual topography of the Colorado River corridor. Some have even ventured into the canyon itself, hiking remote stretches, scanning cliff faces for any sign of an opening that matches the account. A vast tunnel entrance, hidden somewhere above the waterline, waiting to be rediscovered. But a persistent problem emerges. The geography described in the 1909 article does not align with the known landscape of the Grand Canyon. Kincaid mentions travelling upstream from a specific point, reaching a location where the river narrows dramatically and the walls rise steeply on one side while offering a manageable ascent on the other. He describes a cave entrance situated roughly 1,500 feet above the river. These details sound plausible in isolation. The canyon does contain narrow passages and towering cliffs. But when researchers attempt to map these specific instructions onto the actual course of the Colorado, the coordinates refuse to converge. The river does not behave the way the article claims it does at the indicated locations. The landmarks cannot be found. The trail Kincaid describes, the geographical sequence he lays out, leads to places that simply do not exist in the real canyon. This mismatch is one of the strongest arguments against the story's literal truth. Either the location was deliberately obscured to prevent others from finding the site, which some proponents argue, or the entire geographical framework was invented by someone who had never actually navigated those waters. This has led to a spectrum of theories about what the 1909 article actually represents. At one end sits the simplest explanation. The whole thing was a fabrication. A newspaper hoax crafted to fill column space during a slow news period, and designed to captivate readers with an outrageous tale of underground wonders. The early 20th century was an era when papers frequently published sensational stories with little verification. A fictional explorer, a fictional cave, a fictional civilization. No physical evidence was ever produced. No corroborating witnesses ever came forward. The Smithsonian denied any connection. Under this view, the story is pure invention, no different from the tall tales of sea serpents and lost gold mines that appeared in papers across the country during that period. At the other end of the spectrum sits a more nuanced interpretation. Perhaps the article was a garbled account of a genuine discovery. Not Egyptian mummies or copper doors, but something real that became distorted through retelling and embellishment. The Grand Canyon does contain actual caves. Some are large, some are difficult to access, and some have yielded genuine archaeological finds, traces of the indigenous peoples who lived in and around the canyon for thousands of years. What if someone did find a significant cave in 1909, one containing real artifacts from a real ancient culture, and that discovery was then exaggerated and sensationalized beyond recognition? The core element, a cave holding evidence of ancient human presence, might have been authentic, while the exotic details, the hieroglyphs, the idol, the mummies, were layers of fantasy added later. This theory preserves a grain of truth while acknowledging that the story as written cannot be taken at face value. Between these extremes lie countless variations. Some researchers suggest the article was a deliberate piece of disinformation, designed to distract attention from a genuine but sensitive archaeological site. Others propose that Kincaid was a real person who embellished a modest discovery into an extraordinary one. Still others argue that the Smithsonian's denial was itself unreliable, that institutional politics motivated the rejection of a find that would have challenged established narratives about who had inhabited the canyon and when. In recent decades, the internet has breathed new life into this old legend. Discussion forums, documentary films, and social media have carried the story far beyond its original newspaper audience. Each new iteration adds fresh speculation, while recycling the same limited source material. The article is quoted, analysed, reinterpreted, and extended, but never substantiated. Without additional primary sources, without physical evidence, without any trace of Kincaid or Jordan outside that single newspaper piece, the investigation keeps circling back to the same unanswered questions. The digital age has amplified the mystery, but it has not resolved it. It has made the story more accessible, more widely discussed, more vividly imagined, but it has not produced a single new fact. And so the mystery remains unresolved, possibly unresolvable. The evidence that would settle the question, a verified cave matching the description, authenticated artifacts, independent documentation of Kincaid's existence and expedition, may simply not exist. If the story was a hoax, those materials were never real to begin with. If it was a garbled account of something genuine, the original discovery may have been lost to time, collapsed geology, or the erasure of decades. The canyon is vast. It holds countless secrets, but not all secrets yield to searching. Some remain buried not just beneath stone, but beneath the accumulated weight of storytelling, speculation, and the human desire to believe that somewhere in the deep past something extraordinary was left behind, waiting in the dark for us to find it. The search continues because the question remains open. And the question remains open because the answer, whatever it truly is, has never fully surfaced. And so we return to where we began. A single newspaper article from 1909, printed in a regional paper on a spring morning, and the vast, immeasurable silence of the Grand Canyon itself. The story of G. E. Kincaid's underground discovery has persisted for more than a century now, outliving the paper that published it, outliving the institutions that denied it, outliving even the era that produced it. It has travelled from print to radio, from documentary to digital forum, passed from person to person like an old coin worn smooth by countless hands. Each telling adds a new layer of interpretation, a fresh angle of speculation, but the core remains unchanged. An explorer, a cave, a civilization lost to time. The enduring allure of this legend is not really about evidence. It is not about proving whether Kincaid existed or whether the Smithsonian suppressed a discovery. It is about something deeper, something woven into our nature. We are drawn to stories of hidden chambers and vanished peoples because they speak to a fundamental human impulse, the belief that the world still contains vast, uncharted territories, that beneath the familiar surface of things lies a deeper reality waiting to be uncovered. The Grand Canyon is the perfect vessel for this impulse. It is already a place of exposed depths, a landscape where millions of years of geological history are laid bare in striations of coloured stone. When you stand at its rim and look down into that immense rift, you are already looking into the past. The idea that somewhere within those walls behind that stone there exists a passage to an even more ancient past, to a culture that predates everything we thought we knew, feels almost natural. The canyon invites such thoughts. Its scale humbles the imagination and then paradoxically sets it free. The balance between skepticism and wonder is where this story truly lives. Skepticism reminds us that no physical evidence has ever been produced, that the geography described in the article does not align with the real canyon, that the Smithsonian has denied any connection, that newspaper hoaxes were common in the early 20th century, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and in this case, the proof is absent. Wonder reminds us that the canyon is still not fully explored, that new discoveries continue to emerge in remote corners of the world, reshaping our understanding of ancient peoples, that indigenous oral traditions speak of origins and migrations that parallel the Western obsession with lost civilizations, that the human past is deeper and more complex than we often acknowledge, and that we have been surprised before by what the earth has chosen to reveal. Neither skepticism nor wonder alone captures the full truth of this legend. The skeptic is right to demand evidence and find the story wanting. The believer is right to feel the pull of the unknown and resist closing the book too soon. The mystery sits in the space between these positions, in the territory where reasonable doubt and persistent fascination coexist. And perhaps that is where it belongs. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be inhabited, lived with, carried in the mind like a lantern that illuminates not a destination, but the path itself. The 1909 cave story may never yield a definitive answer. No artifact may ever surface. No hidden entrance may ever be found. The question of whether Kincaid's discovery was real, fabricated, or somewhere in between may remain permanently open. And that openness, that refusal to settle into certainty, is precisely what gives the story its power. A solved mystery becomes history, fixed and finalized. An unsolved mystery remains alive, shifting with each generation that encounters it, asking new questions, offering new possibilities. If you have stayed with me through this journey into the canyon's depths and the legend's tangled passages, I hope you have found something worth carrying with you into the night. Not a conclusion, perhaps, but a sense of the vastness that still surrounds us, the pasts that remain hidden, the stories that wait in the dark for someone to listen. If you enjoyed this exploration of prehistoric mysteries and vanished peoples, I want to gently mention that you can find more stories like this one in our book available at sleepytimehistory.com. It dives deeper into ancient secrets and the enduring human fascination with what came before us. Perfect for those nights when you want to let your mind wander through the deep corridors of time before sleep takes over. And if this story has kept you company tonight, I would be grateful if you took a moment to like this video, to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from, and to subscribe so that these journeys can continue reaching you in the quiet hours. Knowing that someone is listening from a small room in a faraway city, or a cabin in the mountains, or an apartment overlooking a sleeping street, brings these stories to life in a way that nothing else can. So let the mystery remain. Let the canyon keep its secrets. Let the question stay open, unanswered, breathing quietly in the back of your mind like a candle that never quite goes out. The past is vast, the earth is deep, and somewhere, perhaps, in the dark, something is still waiting. Rest well tonight, and let your curiosity rest too for now, knowing that when you wake, the world will still be full of wonders left to explore.